You're listening to Buena Vibra with Dr. Ortiz. The content in this podcast is strictly informational and does not substitute psychotherapy treatment or replace the process for clinical diagnosis or psychological prognosis. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Ortiz, and thank you again for joining me on this podcast of Buena Vibra with Dr. Ortiz. I'm really excited because we have our guest speaker today, Paulette Erato, who also is a podcast host with her own podcast called La Vida Más Chévere. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how are you this beautiful Friday
It is
morning?
gorgeous out. It's going to be in the 80s today,
Oh my
which is
gosh.
incredible and also terrifying. It's too early. No, it is a beautiful day out. So very
Yes,
excited for the weekend.
yes. So I want to just, let everybody know how we met. As you all know, I was at the Latin Fest 2023 and Paulette came on, came to my booth and introduced herself. We started talking about, how we each have our podcasts. And Paulette, why don't you tell us a bit about your podcast?
Sure. Like you said, thank you. First of all, thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for having me on. You were the first person I met when I walked into Latina Fest that day, which is, obviously kismet. So my podcast is called La Vida Más Chévere, and it is a Spanglish podcast in that it is centered around the child-free Latina experience. So it's child-free people, mostly Americans, but also, from all of Latino America. And it gives us a space to talk about the ways that our lives are lived differently outside of the societal norms, and a way to feel safe in that, because it's not everyone does, and there's a lot of toxicity and BS in our culture, and that's what I'm here to help people navigate.
Awesome. So why don't you explain to us, like some of the topics that you talk about on your podcast?
Sure. So I do a lot of interviews with women such as yourself. And I also do solo episodes where we focus down into a topic. So the last few have been about perfectionism and the toxic trait of perfeccionismo in our culture, and also self-care, how we don't prioritize ourselves as people, as Latinas. We tend to put the
Mm.
family first. And if you are a child-free person, your family is you. Your family starts with you. But I mean, that's true for all people. Your family starts with the person in the mirror.
Right.
And it's so easy, no matter what culture you're in, I think, to people please and want to do the best for others and forget that number one is right here. So I try to dismantle all of the toxicity in Latin American and American culture. And I'm doing it one episode at a time with one guest at a time.
That's a huge task. But, I think it's really great that you're creating a platform to talk about a lot of the different challenges that we go through. And the things that hold us back, la pena, las juzgas. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about your background,
Sure.
and and how, this podcast, yeah, like what formed this podcast for
Oh, yeah. It is a very long story. Let's distill it down. And the story has many chapters, right?
you?
Because,
Yeah.
I'm a 45-year-old woman at this point, and or almost. And so, we've gone through a lot of chapters and becoming new people in our lives. It's just the cycle. That's, you go through your cocoon and you come out the other side. So I am a first gen Latina in the way that, being half Puerto Rican, my father is American, but he still immigrated here and had an immigrant experience at a young age. So my mother is from Mexico, and she came at a little older age, but they both experienced something that helped shape who I am today, right? And so I am a middle child, la única hija, the only girl.
Mm-hmm.
And there were very high expectations of me from a very young age. And I talked about this recently on my own podcast about being an Ivy League school dropout and the perfectionism and the expectations that were on me, but also I had of myself,
Mm-hmm.
and how when things started to fall apart my freshman year in college, because I'm a fish out of water. I grew up in Los Angeles and go to school on the East Coast, and people are different there. I found Boricuas, which was great because there isn't a lot of us in Los Angeles, and I
Yeah.
didn't know any that I wasn't personally related to.
Uh-huh.
But so there was a lot of culture shock there. And then, the identity I had as a high achiever, 100%er, A+ student completely crumbled to the ground in this new environment. And it really shook me to my core and sent me
Mm-hmm.
into a deep depression. It's like I spiraled out of control mentally. And it took
Mm-hmm.
many years of rebuilding and, going to a local school and being okay with that, and the shame and the guilt and just not living up to my parents' expectations, not living up to my own expectations. It took many, many years to get over that, to unlearn it, to let go, to shed the layers that were keeping me inside this box of those
Mm-hmm.
emotions, and
Mm-hmm.
realize that I am happy. I am a happy woman. Life has not been easy, but I've had a
Mm-hmm.
lot of advantages. I've taken advantage of a lot of things that maybe other people weren't aware that they could too. And I'm here to help shepherd other people going through that, even in one small way or another, through it, just through my own lived experience, with my own lived experience, with the wisdom I've picked up from that. I wrote a very small book for my niece when it was her turn to go off to college. Again, she's la única hija. She's going off to a different environment than the one she grew up in. And I was like, here are the lessons I learned from the time I was your age on. And here's what I wish I knew when I was your age. And the process of writing it all down and putting it together for her became very cathartic for me. And so I've made that available to other people. Like, if you want to buy it, you can. I'll give you a discount code.
That's
It's out
awesome.
there.
Uh,
Am I allowed to cuss on your show?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Because it's called
Yeah.
Benchmarks Are Bullshit. So
Oh.
I just always want to make sure I clear it. Otherwise, it's called Benchmarks Are BS. And it just, and it's geared towards, the 18-year-old kid going off to college. But I've had friends who are in their 40s and 50s read it, and they're like, oh, I needed that reminder. So thank you. um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's a time, I think, whether or not you're going to college, it's a huge transition time for people in their
Mm-hmm.
lives, and that's one of those first chapters that gets written, right? And the
Absolutely.
changes that you go through over the next 10 years. And like, the number one lesson I will impart here for your audience, the number one free lesson is
Uh-huh.
save as much money as possible in an interest-bearing account when you're in your 20s. That first job that offers you a 401k, stuff it, because you're supposed to be poor in your 20s. It's okay to be poor in your 20s. I was super poor in my 20s and still did not stuff it enough. I was like, the compounding interest you get from those first few years
Mm-hmm.
is all time based, and you're never going to get that back. So the one lesson I told her, like, on her birthday, I was like, Mija, 401k, invest, 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 invest. And obviously I've become a little bit more sophisticated in my investing strategy
Right.
since then. And I have a friend, Linda Garcia, who just released a book called Wealth Warriors, and it's like climbing the charts, and it's about Latinos and investing. So plug for her. But I was like, I wish I could get that time back, because no one taught me
Mm.
to do that. So let me tell you now. And she's doing great. She's doing
Yeah.
great. She's having a completely different experience in college than I am. But I was like, what is the thing I always tell you? She's like, stuff your 401k and wear sunscreen.
I think that's, you just threw out so many nuggets, and a lot of it I think is what people can really relate to. Being first gen, myself being one, my parents are from El Salvador, and being the firstborn, only daughter of two. Um, and having to learn and navigate everything that to where I'm at this particular point, it's been a lot of learning, um, lots of tears, because there's so many unknowns, and con un poquito de miedo always.
Always.
Always. And so I think normalizing that experience that, you know, our parents don't understand that. Our parents don't know what it is. Oftentimes, a lot of the times the immigrant parents are coming here to try to form, a foundation for the family and provide a better life and opportunity for the ongoing. And they tell us, right? Ve a la escuela, ve a la universidad, agarra esos títulos. Um, but then, like, when you're, the one going and you don't have anyone to really teach you that, and if you go to, let's say, it's unfortunate, a school maybe that doesn't give you the tools or help you navigate um, those um, those paths, it can be really scary. And a lot of times it can deter someone from going, or there may be a misperception that because I don't have these grades or I don't have this, that I can't go. Or like in your case, being admitted and, the initial joys, right, of being accepted to an Ivy League school, and then reality hits that, like, holy shit, this is really hard. And where's a community of people that look like me? Where's a community of people that like share a story similar to mine? I've definitely had those clients in my office, and a
Mhm.
lot of it has been about helping them, normalizing their experience and helping them navigate that. And also, if that means that where they are in their development isn't really um isn't aligning with where they are, in environmentally, that's okay. If you need to take a break, take that break. It doesn't mean that you've failed,
Oh gosh.
right?
Yeah, the fear of failure is so real. It's so real. And
Hmm.
at 18, it completely cratered my identity. I was like, I got a D in a class that wasn't for my major. I was a marketing major and I was taking a psychology
Oh.
course for some reason, I think. And I got a D despite like studying so hard and thinking I aced it. And then I got a
Mhm,
D and I was like, I could feel my brain spiraling,
mhm,
like trying
mhm,
to make sense of that because it just didn't line up with the reality for myself. I was like, no, I'm a good student. I studied. And so that was my first real experience with failure. Obviously, I'd
mhm,
failed a lot of times up to that point, right? But it was always
mhm.
like negated for the accomplishments. Like I wasn't taught to recognize that failure is just part of life. Like, how many times do you fall down when you're learning to walk or fall off your bike or all these things where the failures are the experience that get you to actually succeed? And so
Right.
it took me so long to come
Mhm,
out of that and to learn that and to recognize that you know, I hadn't I didn't need to give up then.
mhm,
And I don't want to like point fingers at my parents because they were doing the best they could. They taught me the best that they knew how. A lot of it is just like circumstantial, it's cultural, and we're talking three different types of cultures. Growing up in Los Angeles culture, child of immigrant culture, and then East Coast culture, and those three things are all different layers and they're really complex. And then coming back home, and then the shame of just a failing, right? Failing.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
like, okay, well, I guess I'll go to this state school. And it just felt like a huge drop in influence and all these other things that we attach meaning to that really don't mean anything. Like I went to UCLA, that's not a bad school.
no,
It's a date school, sure. But it's, like I had
Mhm.
nothing to be ashamed of, is what I'm saying. It wasn't a drop down. And some
No.
people might want to argue that it is, but like, are they happy in their lives? And
Yeah.
and here we are, 25 years later, and like life is good. Life My life is good. Like I survived a lockdown as an extrovert.
Mm. Mm.
I think
Oh boy.
that's a way bigger accomplishment in my life at this point than
Uh-huh.
6 years in college. And what I got out of that, I'm a different person because I have all that experience behind me. So these
Yeah.
days, I really try to look at failure as a data point that this isn't working. So maybe we turn around and try something different, approach it a different
Mm.
way, that
Mhm.
there's so many ways to solve problems. And usually we just have to, like think outside the box. There's a cliche there for a reason, because
Yeah.
sometimes you just need a
Yeah.
different perspective on the way things are happening. But sometimes you're in it
Mhm.
and it's really hard to see the forest for the trees, or, whatever other cliche you can think of.
Right. No, I think that you bring up something that I think is really important, and it's something that I spoke about in a previous episode, which is all about self-confidence, right?
Mhm.
And um we don't know how to do a lot of things, right? And we have to learn them. So things like riding a bike, learning a second language, driving a car,
Mhm.
navigating college applications.
Ooh, yeah.
you know, um, all of these things take practice, and with practice, we get better. And even when we are amidst the process of practice, there's moments where we're going to fail, quote unquote. We're going to fall and scrape our knees. We're going to make mistakes. And I think that that is probably one of the biggest misconceptions that exists for a lot of people, where the internalization of I'm lacking confidence. I'm a
Mhm.
person who does not have a lot of confidence. I have low self confidence. It's so overgeneralized. And and in listening to you, and the trials and tribulations of your life, in your 20s, figuring it out, being a child of immigrants, trying to figure it out in yeah, between various cultures of the subculture at home, the culture that you grew up in LA, the culture of being on the East Coast, and then maybe the bigger culture of just what American society expects, right? Um, we it's really hard to do it on our own. So
Mhm.
for you, even through this, even as you're like recalling and reflecting, like who have been maybe some of your biggest support systems, or what has that consisted of for you?
I just interviewed a guest on my show, Pam Covarrubias, and she had an experience where she also went to college in a different environment than she was used to. And she said that, she turned to this, she found her community. And I really wish that I had thought to do that at that age, right? That like
Mm.
look for the community there. But I had all these preconceived notions that had been put in my head by, family or media or whatever about who I could and couldn't go to for support. So um, it took a while to find what community meant to me, what it even looked like, right? Because there was the community that was built in at home. Um, and then there was the communities I had created, like I was on the swim team in high school and things like that. And then when I came home and was, 18, 19 for good, because I did, I did my freshman year, I came home and then I went back knowing that this was probably a bad idea. So I did have a community of friends there. It wasn't the same, right? Like the roots weren't as deep. So it took a few years, really, to find a group of people that I trusted enough. I actually fell into art. Art was what I can say, it didn't save me, but it definitely helped pull me out of this destructive spiral I was in for so many years, that and drugs, right? Like I took the antidepressants despite like how at first I was like, no, we're going to do this without drugs. And then I was like, that's stupid. Like if I had broken my arm, I would have a cast on it. So let me just get right about this. If you need medication, you need medication. And this is my own personal,
Yeah.
experience, right? Like I don't want to talk for other people, but like I needed medication. So I took the medication. And once that finally started working and seeing a therapist and a psychiatrist, and I took up photography again because I'd taken it as an elective to get out of high school and then worked on the yearbook a little bit in college. And then when I finally was like getting my life back together in Los Angeles and feeling strong enough to go back to school, I started taking photography very seriously. And then there was all the art kids that I had never like felt comfortable around. Suddenly those were my friends and those were the people I trusted. And we could talk shop. And, from that, you build a social circle and you go to each other's shows and you support each other's artistic endeavors. And then it just grew. And as my interests changed, my groups changed, my communities changed. And through life, I've looked back and realized I always was able to just, if not attract, then find my people. One day my husband and I were coming home from a party and realized that everyone there shared a lot of interests with us and none of them had children. We're like, these are our friends. We have a bunch of adult friends who are also child free, which can be hard. I mean, it's probably a lot easier in a city like LA with millions and millions of people, but it was magical, that moment where we're like, oh, we don't have to pretend.
Oh.
And that happened
Yeah.
because we were involved in a beer club,
Mm-hmm.
an LA meetup for beer enthusiasts.
Mm-hmm.
So community has come in funny ways, but also just out of the need for it as well. I didn't, I can't like write the manual on how to find a community, but I can tell
Right.
you how I did it, and it's been pretty damn good.
Yeah. I mean, I think that community is very unique for every individual, but I think that the important thing to keep in mind is that in order to be successful and in order to achieve and gain and build and maintain that self-confidence, there are certain things that need to be in place. And it's the shift in our mentality of from negative self talk, the criticism, the self judgment, and instead offering ourselves grace and kindness and being gentle with ourselves, which is compassion,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
ingredients for compassion, being self compassionate, and having people around you that are going to cheerlead for you, that are
Oh
going
gosh,
to
yes.
um highlight your strengths. And because even when we are working towards something, yeah, we're gonna go through our moments of questioning ourselves, of the worry and the fear. But when we have certain things in place, um that is still our responsibility, um we begin to see a shift. So it requires consistency, it requires persistence, it requires us to work. And so thank you for sharing that. Now, you mentioned something else, and it's also a highlight of your podcast. You mentioned being child free.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Yeah, go
Do you
ahead.
want to ask me something or do you want me to just
No,
jump
no,
into
no, go ahead.
it? So that's just always been who I was. I never really thought I was going to have kids. For me, it's as natural as the fact that I have brown eyes, I'm right-handed, I have curly hair. It's not a very interesting thing, I think. Like, I think there are way more interesting things I've said and done in my life than that.
Mhm.
But it is a core identity, I guess. Like, as a curly haired woman, like, I have to approach washing and styling my hair very differently. So, as a child free woman, I get to approach life very differently than people I know with kids, with larger families. So it when I realized that there was a lack of, like everywhere, there's a lack of representation of child-free Latinas, I was like, well, this is my space then, because someone has to talk about it. No one's talking to me about it until I found them, right? Like I sought out women to interview. So yes, my podcast actually started as a way to help women, help people gain confidence through creativity. And then, what they teach you when you're starting a new thing like a podcast is you have to niche down, niche down, niche down. So I was like, okay, great. So Latinas or child-free Latinas, let's talk to child-free Latinas. And then in my second season, I was like, okay, we've talked about creativity. Let's talk more about being child-free Latinas. So let me find some people who are also in that space, and maybe they're not like out there advertising it or even advocating for it, but they are very much living their lives as a child-free Latina. So what does that look like for them? And I had really interesting conversations with a whole bunch of different women around it. And that's when I realized, like, I need to talk more about this. Like, this is my focus. And even though I don't think it's very interesting as to define myself as that, it is a way I define myself. And I have found that other people need to hear it. And so I will talk about self-care you can do in your PJs, or how perfectionism is a toxic trait. And that's true for everyone across the board. It's true for everyone. Everyone can do self-care in their PJs. It does not matter if you're a child-free Latina or not. You can be a burly old man with 15 grandchildren. You still need to do self-care. It's just through the lens of the Latina and child-free Latina experience. So I don't think I'm special. I just think I'm the one talking. That's all. And I invite all child-free Latinas I can find into this
Yeah.
space, because we're here. We're not visible because the media has made sure that child-free people are just, have a negative connotation. And there's a lot of fighting against those ideas and the unpacking of like the patriarchy, wanting women to just bear children all the time, and pronatalism and low birth rates, but also no immigration. I could go on a tangent, but the point is that I just want to find I want to present models for child-free Latinas, especially, but child-free people in general, and people in general, that we exist. We are happy with our decisions. We live fulfilling lives. And there's really nothing that would ever change my mind about that, because I'm content. And I measure my success. And this is another thing I had to learn the hard way, but I put it in the book. I measure my success in units of happiness, not finances or other things. Like, am I safe and happy? Okay. The financial success, had I stayed at Wharton, would probably be pretty high. I wasn't the first to go, by the way. So I'm not the first child-free Latina in my family. I'm not the first Ivy League person. I had a cousin who went, and a few years ago, that cousin made it possible for 40 of us to go visit Puerto Rico together and stay there for a week. He paid the bill. And there was there was a tiny conversation with my father. He's like, this could have been you. And I was like, but it's not. And we're never going to talk about that again, because this is the reality of our lives. And I am happy. I am happy. And that's what's important. So had I continued down that road, had I pushed myself to fit in that box, yeah, life would look different. Would I have met my husband and have this stable, satisfying relationship where all of my needs are met and I'm a happy person? Who's to say? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I'm happy with the way the life turned out, and that's success. And I'm really excited about where my life is going. And there was a time in my life when I couldn't say that.
I think that is beautifully said. I mean, success is very subjective. It's really a measure of how you are living your life and the choices that you're making. And what I'm hearing from you is you've been making choices that are solely about focused on you and your needs and what your core values and beliefs and principles are, despite what maybe our loved ones, family members, want for us. That you're making that distinction very clear that you're making your own choices. You're not going to let others make those choices for you. Um, and that's really when we run the risk, right? That when we let other people make choices for us, we're not going to be very happy. And I think that's where it gets murky of the expectations that we set on others of, well, you're not making me happy. Um, you know, uh, you need to do X, Y, and Z because that makes me happy versus taking, again, accountability, that responsibility, that happiness is, first of all, a state of mind. And we're multifaceted. So, what are all of those um, ideals, activities, hobbies, beliefs, values? Um, in people, communities that contribute to our sense of happiness. Um, so I think that's really great, and you're right, even as I'm listening to you speak, there aren't a lot of spaces, safe spaces to identify as child free. I don't know how many of my current clients or, I don't think that I've ever really put it out there, but I am also child free. I am a bonus mommy, um, you know, uh, to, family, to my husband's kids, um, to my niece. Um, and so, but that's not something that I share very much. It's not something like yourself that I really think about too much.
Right.
Um, and that's different for everyone. I mean, I think the piece to keep in mind here is that everyone has their own take on what it means to be child free, and not everyone chooses to be child free also. And so sometimes the life goals that we have in life don't align with the realities don't align with our life goals. And that could be and is very devastating and disappointing. And how do you make sense of that? And how do you then I guess the goal is really, how do you reframe this ideal of living a fulfilling life, right? Um, yeah, I think it's really great. And to destigmatize the idea that, people who are child free are are a very distinct group of individuals. No,
Mhm.
that's not the case.
No. And, there's two things that you said there that I want to speak about.
Hmm.
One about, the child free thing, but also going back to, not living in someone else's box or expectations of you. I don't want to give your listeners the idea that that was easy. Like that took
Mm,
a really long time to learn how to do. And I didn't do it on my own. Like I mentioned, I had psychologists, I had doctors, I had other people I in my community I could talk to about that.
yeah.
What's really great about having a diverse group of friends, not everybody looked like me, but a lot of them did when I finally found my people, right? Is that
Mhm.
they grew up differently. So they had different perspectives on my problems, or, big or small as they might be. And just because I had this upbringing didn't mean it was correct, or that there wasn't another way, again, another way to solve a problem. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that this is an easy thing to do. As a psychologist yourself, I'm sure you're very aware of
Oh,
it.
yeah. I
But
mean,
I just want to make sure that your listeners know, like, that's a process, and it's not over. Like I constantly
Mhm,
am in this process of making sure that my motivation is my own validation, not someone else's. So I want to
mhm,
be very clear there. But the other thing is that because of the stigma around being child free, I don't get into troll arguments online about it. Like, I'm not going to be that person. I don't have
mhm.
the bandwidth, and it isn't good for my mental health to do that. However, I will sit here and provide a model for a fulfilling child free life so that other people
Mm.
who may find themselves in this situation, either by choice or circumstance, have something to point to that says, I might be okay. I am going to be okay. And not all of the women that I interviewed and am currently interviewing made the choice to be child free. For a few of them, that was determined by biology, and they had to choose to be okay with that, right? Like you
Mhm.
said, happiness can be a perspective, mind shift. You can choose to grieve and
Absolutely.
be unhappy, and it's okay to feel all those feelings, but at the end of the day, if you cannot change that circumstance, you have to make peace with it, and maybe even find happiness with now all of the other options that you get to have in your life, because that
Mhm.
one wasn't one of them. So again, I'm just a model for that, and
Mm.
I'm so appreciative for people like you having me on your shows so I can talk about it to a larger
Mhm.
audience, because whether or not you have children is not your total worth. It's just,
Yeah,
it isn't.
absolutely. No, and I appreciate you saying that because I think it goes into one of the areas that I'm very big on, which is, setting those healthy boundaries
Mhm.
for yourself. And that's what you're talking about is, you're going to choose who you're going to lean on that is that aligns with where you are going in life. And there may be moments where you may need to distance yourself or um, interact less with, or maybe avoid certain topics with particular individuals that may not be aligning with where you're going in life at any particular season. And that's okay to do. And it's really, really hard, especially within, generally speaking, the Latino family system where everyone is so enmeshed and so involved in las decisiones se hacen dentro de la familia. Everybody knows your business,
Mhm, mhm.
right? And how do you begin to separate yourself from that if all of that is true for you, without getting the criticism, or the las juzgas, the judgments
Yeah,
around it. Yeah.
yeah. It's a
Yeah.
process. It's a ever
Definitely.
going process. And the older and more experience that one gets, here's
Mhm.
the bright side. The easier it is to take from that experience and have your wisdom to do it. It does become easier. It doesn't ever stop, but it does become easier
Mm. Mhm.
because you've done it so many times. And again, that confidence to do it, it comes from the experience of doing it. Just like learning to swim. You're not going to learn to
Yeah.
swim watching a YouTube video. You got to get in the water and do it. And you're not going to be very good at it because you don't know how to hold your breath underwater yet,
Right.
but you'll figure it out. And as you swim more and more, you get
Mhm.
faster, you get stronger, it becomes easier overall. And that's what setting boundaries and all of these, the hard knocks of life teach you. Eventually it gets easier.
Yes. Yes. You know, this has been so great talking to you, Paulette.
Mm.
Again, La Vida Más Chévere. If you have not checked her out yet, checked out this podcast yet, I strongly encourage that you do. Um, how can, for any of my listeners who are interested in learning more about you, is there a website or,
Yeah.
with your podcast, is it across most major podcasts?
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about
Sure. So La
that.
Vida Más Chévere can be found on all platforms. Not yet on YouTube, but don't worry, eventually.
Mhm.
But any platform, Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, Stitcher. I don't know if that one's still available, but if there's an art, if there's a platform you can't find it on, let me know. And you can always find me as at Paulette Erato on all social media. And then the website is pauletteerato.com.
So awesome. Thank you so much again for being a guest, for coming to my booth and showing us so much love.
Oh, that was so great.
Yes, yes. And again, I hope that you are a guest here on our show next, for another episode sometime soon. I'd love to have you again. And, for you listeners out there, thank you so much for joining me and Paulette in our conversation. I hope you've gained nuggets from this. And as always, mucha, mucha, mucha buena vibra. You have just listened to an episode with Dr. Ortiz in Buena Vibra. I hope you enjoyed this episode and subscribe. Join me next week, and until then, sending you off with Buena Vibra.